Welcome back. Today in language arts, we are going to do some more work with Flora and Ulysses. On Monday, we wrote a paragraph about whether or not we thought Flora was a cynic. And then yesterday, we did our character map. Today, we're going to go back to paragraph writing. And our topic today is going to be about that thing with the sunglasses that we've talked about before. At least 3 times in this book so far, Kate DiCamillo, the author, has mentioned that Flora looks at William Spiver trying to see him, but she just keeps seeing her own reflection, which to me is a huge metaphor, right? Seeing your own reflection in someone else. So we're going to write about what we think that means today. Before we get started, I will remind you of our paragraph structure because we're going to follow that again today. We're going to start off by introducing the topic. Then we're going to give a little bit of background information. Then we're going to make our claim or thesis. Then we're going to give some evidence to support our claim or thesis. And finally, we're going to tie that evidence back to our claim or thesis. Okay, so let's get started. First off, let's just talk about that a little bit. So there's 3 different times where she looks at William Spiver trying to see his eyes, and she just sees her own reflection. Now, I know that authors don't put things like that in books by accident. Kate DiCamillo is definitely trying to tell us something. And what I think is that it is a big, fat metaphor for Flora realizing that, or maybe not realizing yet, but I think eventually she's going to see that she and William Spiver have a lot in common. I don't know about you, but I already feel like I can see them as having a lot in common. And it's kind of funny right now because Flora's a little bit annoyed by him, but William really likes her a lot and wants to be around her and wants to talk to her. Flora's just not quite sure what to think about him. So what my paragraph is going to be about is that this is a metaphor for Flora and William Spiver having something in common. So I'm going to start off by giving a little bit of background information. So you can see here there are 3 times in the first few chapters of Flora and Ulysses when Flora talks about seeing her own reflection in William Spiver's sunglasses. That's my background information. Okay? Then my claim or my thesis is I think Kate DiCamillo, the author, is trying to show that Flora and William Spiver have a lot in common. Okay? So really, that's 2 sentences to begin our paragraph. The first one is to let the reader know that this is something that keeps coming up again and again in the book. Remember again and again the signpost? We know that means something important. So let the reader of your paragraph know there's this thing that keeps happening, and then make your claim. Why is that happening? Because I think those 2 have a lot in common. So if you want to pause the video now and write that section of your paragraph, you can do that. Okay, ready for the evidence? So I was thinking about William and Flora and thinking about what they have in common. And one thing is that they're kind of loners, right? Flora never mentions any friends. She never has any friends over. There's no friends in this book of Flora's at all. In fact, her mother is excited when William Spiver shows up because she's like, oh, good, a little friend for Flora. And Flora's like, I don't need a little friend, right? And then William Spiver, poor kid, sent here to live with his aunt because of something bad that happened with his family that we don't know about yet. So he's kind of a loner too. So that's one thing that I noticed they had in common, is they're both kind of loners. Another thing that they have in common is that they're both kind of quirky, right? Would you say? William Spiver talks in this very quirky adult way, and Flora is always talking as if she's narrating a comic book. So I think that's the other thing that they have in common. And those are my two pieces of evidence. So here's me writing about my two pieces of evidence. One thing they have in common is that they are both loners. William Spiver is living with his aunt because he has nowhere else to go. Flora spends all her time reading comic books by herself. Okay, there's my first piece. Look at it now, you can see one thing they have in common is that they are both loners. William Spiver is living with his aunt because he has nowhere else to go. Flora spends all of her time reading comic books by herself. That's my first piece of evidence. My next piece of evidence is that thing that I said about them both being kind of quirky. So I wrote, another thing they have in common is that they are both kind of quirky. Neither one of them speaks or acts like a typical kid. That's my second piece of evidence. The second thing they have in common. Another thing they have in common is that they are both kind of quirky. Neither one of them speaks or acts like a typical kid. And finally, tying my evidence back into my claim. I'm not sure Flora realizes it yet, but she and William Spiver have a lot in common. Okay? So that's me tying that evidence back to my original claim, which is that it's about them having stuff in common. So now I will read the whole thing start to finish. There are 3 times in the first few chapters of Flora and Ulysses when Flora talks about seeing her own reflection in William Spiver's sunglasses. I think Kate DiCamillo, the author, is trying to show that Flora and William Spiver have a lot in common. One thing they have in common is that they are both loners. William Spiver is living with his aunt because he has nowhere else to go. Flora spends all her time reading comic books by herself. Another thing they have in common is that they are both kind of quirky. Neither one of them speaks or acts like a typical kid. I'm not sure Flora realizes it yet, but she and William Spiver have a lot in common. Okay? So take some time to write your paragraph. You can also disagree with me if you want and write something different about what that means. I'd love to hear from you either way. Email those to me if you get a chance, and I will give you some feedback. And thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.